Ladies and gentlemen, we have now started the next part of our webinar. And let me say hi to Lasse Brand from Köln. Is that correct? Lasse, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mate.
I can say Guten Morgen in German, but you know, my German is like my car from second hand. So, but that's always enough to say hello. So Lasse, if you're ready, just go ahead. I will be here to ask questions from the audience. And to the audience, please use chat to ask questions in English or Slovenian, whichever you prefer. And Lasse, the webinar is all yours, so go ahead.
Thank you, Mate. Thank you also, Aljas, for the introduction. I hope you can see my screen now.
We can.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I can't speak Slovenian, not even secondhand, but it sounded like I've been introduced. So I will dig right into the topic, and yeah, I will present in English. Slow me down if it's needed. So my name is Lasse Brand from Ruprecht Consult, and I have worked a lot on the SUMP guidelines that were released last year. And after finishing that, one of my main tasks has been to develop a specific guide for smaller cities and towns. It's not released yet, but there's a close to final draft available, and I'm glad to present it to you today. So my presentation will fully focus on this new guide. I have understood that most of you have good experience with SUMP, Sustainable Urban Mobility Planning, so I won't give a general introduction. And after a short background to the guide, my main 3 points of the presentation will be: 1, the specific mobility challenges and benefits in smaller cities; 2, what might be different in terms of the planning process and the planning steps; and then 3, the concrete policies and measures that the guide recommends. It's roughly 12 to 15 minutes, and afterwards I'll be looking forward to your questions. So as a short background, who wrote the guide and what is it based on? I based my ideas mainly on my consultancy work directly for smaller cities, and especially regular discussions with a group of 20 smaller cities as part of a European learning group in the project Civitas Sums Up have inspired me in some of my recommendations. But of course, I did not write it alone. It builds upon the main SUMP guidelines, which were developed in a big stakeholder process with over 300 experts. And for the small city guide itself, I collaborated with a range of experienced transport planners from different countries in Europe to make sure that the recommendations really fit also for different circumstances. And these experts, they reviewed the ideas, and they also contributed own text sections, sometimes examples and highlights and so on. So also for the city examples, then I made sure to have a balance from all parts. Then maybe to give a short overview of the content of the guide. You don't have to read through all of this. It's just to give an overview, the table of contents. There's 2 introductory chapters, 1 and 2, that explain the different types of smaller cities, the specific mobility challenges, and the benefits. Then comes the main part, chapter 3 and 4, that are the planning recommendations. How could strategic mobility planning work well also in smaller cities with, for example, limited resources? And then finally, in the chapter 5, we recommend concrete measures that have worked well in other smaller cities and might also be useful for you. And personally, I think this last chapter is one of the biggest improvements because it makes it quite concrete. And even if you are not so interested in the process recommendations, there's still some concrete content that you could directly use for your city. So today I won't have time to present all of this, but I will focus on the main points. And firstly, the question is always, what is a smaller city? And there's many different definitions in different countries. So I won't nail down a specific number. I don't think that's so important. For me, it's more important that it's not a rural area, so it's bigger. It's possible to plan for itself, has some competencies in mobility planning, but it's not a big city either with those urban problems and urban dimensions. So it's in between, and in fact, a lot of cities in Europe are especially here in between. And what I think is quite important is that even though, of course, there are many types of cities, if they are close to a big city or far away, has a big impact, the functional dimension, but many of them share some challenges in mobility planning. One is that they tend to be quite car-dependent communities, struggling to have an attractive public transport system, and often also a low share of walking and cycling. And then when it comes to planning, usually there's quite limited resources for planning, often only 1 or 2 people working on transport planning who also have to cover other topics. And even though there's less people involved, so sometimes decision-making can be quicker and more effective, usually it's also quite dependent on higher levels, on the regional, national level, for funding and for some infrastructure. So that dimension also sets some boundaries. And then finally, another hinder can be that sometimes there's the perception that the negative impacts of traffic are not so important. Yes, air quality, congestion, that's a problem in the big cities, but here in the small city, we don't have this, so we don't really need to care about this topic. But in my opinion, this misses some important dimensions that are caused by transport. For example, smaller cities are often heavily affected by the lack of daily physical activities of residents, by shops or other services in the town center closing down, young people moving to the cities, and also speeding cars, noise from through traffic, big trucks, and so on. So a lot of things that affect your city and make it less pleasant and attractive. And so you should still think about transport because it affects these other areas. So in my opinion, SUMP is a good tool to approach these topics strategically, to have a clear direction how to keep your town attractive and attractive to new residents also. Because nowadays, bike-friendly, walkable, attractive public spaces and good social connections have become major selling points to attract and retain residents. This is something that people really want to have in the place they live, but they also want to have the entertainment and the services and public service and so on that you get in the big cities. So that's kind of the challenge more for smaller cities, as I see it. And then also in terms of planning, this is the bottom row, the 4, SUMP can improve the situation. It can provide visibility and better access to EU funding and national funding. Can be a vehicle to coordinate regionally. It can improve knowledge management. And then finally, it can help you to make more effective use of limited resources. And I think this last point is crucial because SUMP developing such a plan is an effort, and that is something that is often mentioned as a hinder. But once you have an agreed list of priorities and measures in place, it can save a lot of time and money afterwards in the daily work and also in the daily political discussion. But how are all these wonderful things then going to be achieved? Which planning steps are essential to develop a SUMP in a smaller city with limited resources? And here is the SUMP cycle from the main guidelines. And the general structure is basically the same in smaller cities as in bigger ones. Regardless if you are big or small, you will need to take a political decision to change in a sustainable direction. You need to set up working structures, bring important stakeholders on board, do a good analysis, agree on a shared vision, objectives and targets, so the general direction, then define measures that fit your targets, agree on responsibilities and financing, so who does what and who pays for what. Then you adopt the plan in the political setting, and then finally you implement the measures, coordinating and monitoring. So the general structure is the same, but the way each step is done and the balance between the different steps tends to be quite different. And here I'd like to highlight three points. Firstly, smaller cities tend to require much less time for the plan development. From the different European countries, around 1 year, including plan approval, seem to be quite common, whereas larger cities usually need considerably more time. And as this perception that it takes a lot of time and effort is often mentioned as a hinder by smaller cities, we have recommended simplified methods in each of the 12 steps that make it possible to develop it quicker. I don't have time to go into each step now, but some of the aspects that make the process quicker are that there are fewer stakeholders usually that have to be involved. There's a smaller city area and transport network that needs to be analyzed, that you can limit yourself to only a few key objectives and targets, and that you can focus on only a few measure categories, because some types of measures will simply not be relevant for you. I mean, there is no metro to be built, and so on. And then finally, maybe that it can be easier to get all important decision makers around one table, also because it's a smaller setting. But of course, it's not as easy as it sounds, but still, I think if you set it up in the right way, it shows that you can be quite quick. And the second point is that usually there's more emphasis on the operational phase, so on the second phase, the measures and the implementation, and less on the strategic phase, on the vision, because the mobility system tends to be less complex, so often you can agree on a vision and objectives relatively quickly, and it doesn't have to be extremely long or extremely detailed. It's more an agreement on the general direction. And then you can focus a lot on the measures. And that's, of course, more challenging to find the right measures. And therefore, we have put an entire chapter with suggestions, which one could work well. And then thirdly, the focus on the regional level is really important because often there's a dependence on the regional level. It can be difficult in practice because the regional authorities are not always so interested to get involved in the local planning process. That's why one option could be to develop the plan directly on the regional level, functional urban area level. But of course, this is a complex task and it's not always possible. So another option is to only organize certain things on a regional level, especially public transport, because it will be close to impossible to have an attractive public transport system in a small city if it's not integrated with a region. And so you could plan some areas only for your city, walking and cycling, for example, and then some areas you plan on the regional level. So only to highlight these three things, I won't have time to go into detail, but in the guide, there is detailed recommendations for each step, and it works as a standalone document. So you don't need to read the main guidelines because the 130 pages from there have been summarized and condensed to only 30 pages in this new guide, and the recommendations have been changed to smaller cities. So as a smaller city, you would only need to read this one guide. And then finally, let's look at the measures. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. It depends on your specific mobility situation and city structure, and of course also on what you have already done, which measures are the most interesting for you. But some measures have proven to work well in many smaller cities and towns. So if they are not covered yet, it can be useful to start with them. And as some general recommendations, it can be clever to start with popular measures that show quick results, and in that way create further support for changes. And visible problem spots could present such an opportunity. For example, if there is a ugly train station or a boring dead part of town, city center, or if there are traffic accidents close to schools or in other parts, if you tackle this, you could create more support for further changes. And in terms of geography, you could start with the center, then work your way outwards from there, because most people see changes in the center. It could be an illustration for what is possible, which could then spread to other parts of town. And light and cheap solutions, I think, have a lot of potential and a strong collaboration with the inhabitants. For example, using placemaking approaches or temporary measures, which have been a trend a bit in recent years, and we will hear also more about this, I think, in Yelena's presentation. And to use this usually small budget efficiently, I'd say one of the main recommendations is to explore other options before building a lot of expensive new infrastructure. And then finally, keep it simple, cover the fundamentals before getting into very complex, expensive technical solutions. There's many easy or simple solutions that work really well. More concretely, the guide presents proven approaches in 10 measure fields. Each of them is described on 2 to 4 pages, also always with concrete city examples. I don't have time to go into them now, and I didn't want to pick out a favorite measure because they can all be good depending on the circumstances. So I will only list the 10 fields now. Safe and healthy schools, as I already mentioned, can be a really good starting point, also because it's popular. The same with residential areas. And then, yeah, I think I don't have time to go into them now. Maybe we can do that in the discussion at 1 o'clock. But I would like to, maybe also to prepare this a little bit, I would like to finish with a poll question by asking which of these 10 measure fields your city is already working on. Great, yeah, it already pops up. Take your time to read through them. I mean, it's the usual suspects, I would say. But in each of these fields, there are some really proven measures that you could start with that also are manageable with limited resources.
Yes, I've already answered the poll, and hopefully others are following. The poll is in Slovenian. I hope you'll be able to interpret the answers. You may ask for help, but some terms are international. Can we see the results? The results are coming in from 55 participants. You said that you had your suspects.
You mean my favorite options, or?
Oh no, what you believe our answers will be like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to influence the answers now, but I would think the last one is probably low. Yeah.
Okay, so let's comment on that. Here are the results.
It's the same order, right? So I can.
Yes, sure.
So then cycling is very high.
Yes.
That is interesting. But I mean, it's expected that cycling is always much higher than walking, because walking often it's seen as a given, it's there anyways. But I think you can do really good things also by in promoting walking. Also great to see that school mobility is so high. because I think work starting from the area around schools, maybe make traffic calming them, and then making also the routes to school safer, you can actually affect quite a part of the city by leveraging a topic that is uncontroversial, because everyone would be for safe mobility for children.
I can perhaps explain the cycling answer, because there's a lot of financing from European Union for the cycling infrastructure right now. And also the path I took today to come here, I went through some road works actually for cyclists. So yeah, that's this poll actually reflects the reality in Slovenia.
And I'm really happy about the high percentage for parking, because I think, yeah, it's usually a difficult topic, but it's a very powerful tool for cities to work with.
Okay. Lasse, are you ready to take questions from the audience?
Yes.
I took a screenshot where it says start with popular measures, and what is your #1 most popular measure? The easiest one. I thought there were no popular measures when you're considering SUMP. I mean, some people believe there are none.
Well, there are, of course, there are no measures that everyone likes, but some, I think, are less controversial. And I think school mobility is one of them. Of course, also there you might, yeah, if you change something, there's always a little bit of resistance and people get used to it. But if you pick something emotional, or I mean, many people are parents, or they are grandparents, or they at least they know, or they remember their own childhood, so they can relate to this, and they can maybe see a personal benefit also. I think that's a good. Then I think public space activation can also be good and powerful. If you take parts of town where everyone thinks, they are a bit dull, they are a bit gray, and it's unsafe, it's not really so pleasant here. And if you have then quick and cheap measures to make them more pleasant, a new gathering place, the market square or something, I think that is also usually something that is uncontroversial.
I have another question. Do you propose SUMP for all towns, no matter the size? What would be the smallest relevant settlement?
That's a difficult question. It depends a bit on the administrative rights in the country. I mean, who has the planning authority for, as I said, I think optimally it would be often several smaller cities together. I mean, I can only, for example, in Germany, small cities usually don't have the rights. They are integrated into a bit bigger cities of maybe 20, 30,000 inhabitants. If you only have 500 inhabitants, I think then you don't need to do this. And then where the exact border is, I don't know, somewhere 5, 10,000, depends. But yeah, you could, I mean, you could, if you focus on only certain topics, then of course you could still also do something in a smaller city.
One last question for you. Your guide will probably be free to download. Can you estimate the date, or will we receive some information about it?
Yes, it will be free. It will definitely appear on ELTIS, so the European Knowledge Platform, eltis.org, I think. For a date, it depends a bit on a review also by the European Commission. In autumn, definitely, after summer, I would say, but no exact date yet. But of course, I will let you know at UIRS, and then I would be very glad if you could then also spread the news.
Okay, thank you very much, Lasse Brand. We will be talking to you again in the discussion groups. There are a lot of other questions as well, but we don't have time to answer them all. But this is a good news about the discussion groups later on. So we'll talk to you later, Lasse. Thank you very